pass through the gate. I'd like a few words with you before we part. In private. Perhaps in here. Dumbledore pointed to...
The walk back to the city was better than 2 miles, across low hills that worked the ache out of Matt's leg and put it back again before they topped a rise and saw Abu Dar ahead, behind its extravagantly thick, white-plastered wall that no siege catapult had ever been able to break down. The city within was white, too, though here and there pointed domes bore thin stripes of color. The white-plastered buildings, white spires and towers, white palaces, gleamed even on a gray winter day. Here and there, a tower ended in a jagged top, or a gap showed where a building had been destroyed. But in truth, the Shonchan conquest had occasioned little damage. They had been too fast, too strong, and in control of the city before more than scattered resistance could form. Surprisingly, such trade as there was this time of year had hardly faltered with the city's fall. The Shonchan encouraged it, though merchants and ship captains and crews were required to take an oath to obey the forerunners, await the return, and serve those who come home. In practice, that meant largely going about your life as usual, so few objected. The broad harbor was more crowded with ships every time Matt looked at it. This afternoon, it seemed he could have walked from Abu Dar proper across to the Rahad, a rough quarter he would just as soon never revisit. Often in the days after he first managed to walk again, he had gone down to the docks to stare, not at the vessels with ribbed sails, or the seafolk ships that the Shonchan were re-rigging and manning with their own crews, but at craft flying the golden bees of Ilion, or the sword in hand of Aradaman, or the crescents of Tyr. He no longer did. Today, he barely glanced toward the harbor. Those dice spinning in his head seemed to roar like thunder. Whatever was going to happen, he very much doubted he would like it. He seldom did, when the dice gave warning. Though a steady stream of traffic flowed out of the great arched gateway, and people afoot seemed to be squeezing through to get in, a thick column of wagons and ox carts stretching all the way back to the rise was waiting to enter and hardly moving. Everyone departing on a horse from Shonchan, whether with skin as dark as one of the sea folk or pale as a Karianin. And they stood out for more than being mounted. Some of the men wore voluminous trousers and odd tight coats with high collars that fit their necks snugly right to the chin, and rows of shiny metal buttons down the front, or flowing elaborately embroidered coats almost as long as a woman's dress. They were of the blood, as were the women in strangely cut riding dresses that seemed made of narrow pleats, with divided skirts cut to expose colorfully booted ankles, and wide sleeves that hung to their feet in the stirrups. A few wore lace veils that hid all but their eyes, so their faces were not exposed to the lowborn. Most of the riders, by far, however, wore brightly painted armor of overlapping plates. Some of the soldiers were women, too, though there was no way to tell which, with those painted helmets like the heads of monstrous insects. At least none wore the black and red of the Death Watch Guard. Even other Shonchan seemed nervous around them, and that was enough to warn Matt to walk wide around them. In any case, none of the Shonchan spared so much as a glance for 3 men and a boy slowly walking toward the city along the column of waiting carts and wagons. Well, the men walked slowly. Oliver skipped. Matt's leg was setting their pace, but he tried not to let the others see how much he was leaning on his staff. The dice usually announced incidents he managed to survive by the skin of his teeth. Battles, a building dropping on his head. Tylin. He dreaded what would happen when they stopped this time. Nearly all of the wagons and carts leaving the city had Shonchan driving or walking alongside, more plainly dressed than those on horses, hardly peculiar looking at all, but those in the waiting line were more likely to belong to Abu Dari or folk from the surrounding area. Men in long vests, women with their skirts sewn up on one side to expose a stockinged leg or colorful petticoats, their wagons as well as their carts pulled by oxen. Outlanders dotted the column, merchants with small trains of horse-drawn wagons. There was more trade in winter here in the south than farther north, where merchants had to contend with snow-covered roads, and they came from far, some of them. A stout Domani woman with a dark beauty patch on her copper cheek, riding the lead of 4 wagons, clutched her flowered cloak around her and scowled at a man 5 wagons ahead of her in the line, a greasy-looking fellow, hiding long, thick mustaches behind a Tarabana veil, beside the wagon driver. A competitor, no doubt. Aline Pandoy, a large pearl in her left ear and silver chains across her chest, sat her saddle calmly, gloved hand folded on the pommel, maybe still unaware that her gray gelding and her wagon teams alike would be put into the lottery once she was into the city. 1 horse in 5 had been taken from locals, so as not to discourage trade, 1 in 10 from outlanders. Paid for, true, and a fair price in other days, but not nearly what the market was there, given the demand. Matt always noticed horses, only half as minor was. A fat Kyrienin in a coat as drab as those of his wagon drivers was shouting angrily about the delay and letting his fine bay mare dance nervously. A very good confirmation on that mare. She would be an officer, most likely. What was going to happen when the dice stopped? The wide-arched gates into the city had their guards, though it was likely only the Shonchan recognized them as such. Suldam, in their lightning-paneled blue dresses, threaded back and forth through the streams of traffic with gray-clad Domani on silvery Idam. Just one of those pairs would have been sufficient to quell any disturbance short of a full-scale assault, and maybe even that. But that was not the real reason for their presence. In the first days after Abadar's fall, while he was still confined to bed, they had harrowed the city searching for the women they called Marath Domani, and now they made sure none could enter. The Suldam each carried an extra leash coiled on her shoulder just in case. Pairs patrolled the docks, too, meeting every arriving ship and boat. Beside the wide-arched gate into the city, a long platform displayed, on spikes 20 feet above the ground, the tarred but still recognizable heads of over a dozen men and 2 women who had fallen afoul of Shonchan justice. Above them hung the symbol for that justice, a headsman's slant-edged axe, with the haft wrapped in an intricately knotted white cord. A placard below each head announced the crime that had placed it there: murder or rape, robbery with violence, assault on one of the blood. Lesser offenses brought fines or flogging were being made dakovea. The Shonchan were even-handed about it. None of the blood themselves were on display. One of those who earned execution would be sent back to Shonchan or strangled with the white cord. But 3 of those heads had been attached to Shonchan, and the weight of their justice fell on high as well as low. 2 placards marked rebellion, hung below the heads of the woman who had been mistress of the ships to the Athan Mier and her master of the blades. Matt had been through that gate often enough that he barely noticed the display now. Oliver skipped along singing a rhyming song. Veslin and Tom walked with their heads together, and once Matt caught a soft, risky business from Tom, but he did not care what they were talking about. Then they were into the long, dim tunnel that carried the road through the wall, and the rumble of wagons passing through would have made listening impossible, even had he wanted to. Keeping close to the side, well away from the wagon wheels, Tom and Veslin forged ahead, talking in low murmurs, Oliver darting after them. But when Matt emerged into daylight again, he walked into Tom's back before he realized that all of them had stopped, hard beside the tunnel's mouth. On the point of making a caustic comment, he suddenly saw what they were staring at. People afoot pushing out of the tunnel behind him shoved them aside, but he just stared too. The streets of Abu Dar were always full of people, but not like this. As though a dam had burst and sent a flood of humanity into the city. The throng packed the street in front of him from one side to the other, surrounding pools of livestock the like of which he had never seen before, spotted white cattle with long upswept horns, pale brown goats covered in fine hair that hung to the paving stones, sheep with 4 horns. Every street he could see looked as jammed. Wagons and carts inched through the mass where they moved at all. The shouts and curses of the wagon drivers and carters all but drowned in the babble of voices and the noise of the animals. He could not make out words, but he could distinguish accents. slow, drawling Shonchan accents. Some of them nudged a neighbor and pointed at him in his bright clothing. They were gaping and pointing at everything, as if they had never seen an inn or a cutler's shop before. But he still growled under his breath and jerked his hat brim low over his eyes. "The return," Tom muttered, and if Matt had not been right at his shoulder, he would not have heard. "While we were taking our ease with Luca, the Koren has arrived." Matt had been thinking of this return that the Shonchan kept going on about as an invasion, an army. One of the wagon drivers shouted and waved her long-handled whip at some boys who had crawled up on the side of the wagon box to poke at what appeared to be grapevines in wooden tubs of earth. Another wagon held a long printing press, and still another, just managing to turn into the tunnel, carried what looked like brewers' vats and a faint smell of hops. Crates of strangely colored chickens and ducks and geese decorated some of those wagons, not birds for sale, but a farmer's stock. It was an army, all right, only not the sort he had imagined. This kind of army would be harder to fight than soldiers. "Stab my eyes. We'll have to wade to get through this," Veslin grumbled in disgust, rising on his toes to try peering farther ahead over the crowd. "How far before we find a clear street?" Matt found himself remembering what he had not really seen when it was in front of his eyes, the harbor full of ships. Full of ships. Maybe 2 or 3 times the vessels that had been there when they left for Luca's camp at first light, quite a few of them still maneuvering under sail, which meant there might be more still waiting to enter the harbor. Light. How many could have disgorged their cargo since morning? How many remained to be unloaded? Like, how many people could be carried on that number of ships? And why had they all come here instead of Tanchico? A shiver ran down his spine. Maybe this was not all of them. "You had best try to find your way by back streets and alleys," he said, raising his voice so they could hear over the cacophony. "You won't reach the palace before night otherwise." Veslin turned a frown on him. "You aren't returning with us? Matt, if you try to buy passage on a ship again, you know she won't go easy on you this time." Matt matched the Queen's son's scowl for scowl. "I just want to walk around a little," he lied. As soon as he returned to the palace, Tylin would start cosseting and petting him. It would not have been that bad, really. Not really. Except that she did not care who saw her caress his cheeks and whisper endearments in his ear, even her son. Besides, what if the dice in his head stopped when he reached her? Possessive was hardly the word for Tylin these days. Blood and ashes, the woman might have decided to marry him. He did not want to marry, not yet. But he knew who he was going to marry, and it was not Tylin Quintara Mitsubar. Only, what could he do if she decided differently? Suddenly, he remembered Tom's murmur of risky business. He knew Tom, and he knew Veslin. Oliver was gaping at the Shonchan as hard as they themselves were at everything around them. He started to dart away for a closer look, and Matt seized his shoulder just in time and pushed him, protesting, into Tom's hands. "Take the boy back to the palace and give him his lessons when Roselle is done with him. And forget whatever madness you have in mind. You could put your heads on display outside the gate, and Tylin's too. And his own. Never let that be forgotten." The 2 men stared back at him without any expression, as good as confirming his suspicions. "Perhaps I should walk with you," Tom said at last. "We could talk. You're remarkably lucky, Matt, and you have a certain flair for, shall we say, the adventurous." Veslin nodded. Over squirmed in Tom's grip, trying to stare at all the strange people at once, and unconcerned with what his elders were talking about. Matt grunted sourly. Why did people always want him to be a hero? Sooner or later, that sort of thing was going to get him killed. "I don't need to talk about anything. They are here, Veslin. If you couldn't stop them getting in, sure as morning, you won't be able to push them out. Rand will deal with them, if the rumors are anything to go by." Again, those whirling colors spun through his head, almost obliterating the sound of the dice for an instant. "You took that bloody oath to wait on the return. We all did." Refusal had meant being put in chains and set to work on the docks or clearing the canals in the Rahad. which made it no oath at all in his book. Wait on Rand. The colors came once more and vanished. Blood and ashes, he just had to stop thinking about certain people. Again they swore.
Hey, Sam Squash, how you doing?
It might come out right yet,
Good to
if you give
see
it
ya.
time. You don't understand, Matt, Veslin said fiercely.
How you been
Mother
doing?
still sits on the throne, and Siroth says she will rule all of Altara. Not just what we hold around Abu Dar, and maybe more besides. But Mother had to lie down on her face and swear fealty to some woman on the other side of the Arith Ocean. Siroth says I should marry one of their blood and shave the sides of my head. And Mother is listening to her. Siroth might pretend they are equals, but she has to listen when Siroth speaks. No matter what Siroth says, Abu Dar isn't really ours anymore, and the rest won't be either. Maybe we can't push them out by force of arms, but we can make the country too hot to hold them. The White Cloaks found out. Ask them what they mean by the Altaran noon. Matt could guess without asking anyone. He bit his tongue to keep from pointing out that there were more Shonchan soldiers in Abu Dar than there had been White Cloaks in all of Altara during the White Cloak War. A street full of Shonchan was no place for a flapping tongue, even if most did appear to be farmers and craftsfolk. I understand you're hot to put your head on a spike, he said quietly, as quietly as he could and still be heard in that din of voices and cattle lowing and geese honking. You know about their listeners. That fellow over there who looks like a stableman could be one, or that skinny woman with the bundle on her back. Veslin glowered so hard at the pair Matt had pointed out that if they really were listeners, they might report him for that alone. Maybe you'll sing a different song when they reach Andor, he growled, and pushed his way into the throng, shoving anyone who got in his way. Matt would have been unsurprised to see a fight break out. He suspected that was what the man was looking for. Tom turned to follow with Oliver, but Matt caught his sleeve. Cool his temper if you can, Tom. And cool your own while you're about it. I would think by this time you'd have had enough of shaving blind. My head is cool. And I'm trying to cool his, Tom said dryly. He can't just sit, though. It is his country. A faint smile crossed his leathery face. You say you won't take risks, but you will. And when you do, you'll make anything Veslin and I might try look like an evening stroll in the garden. With you around, even the barber is blind. Come along, boy, he said, swinging Oliver up onto his shoulders. Rizal might not let you rest your head if you're late for your lesson. Matt frowned after him as he strode away, making much better progress with Oliver straddling his neck than Veslin had. What did Tom mean? He never took risks unless they were forced on him. Never. He glanced casually toward the skinny woman and the fellow with the dung on his boots. Like they could be listeners. Anybody could be. It was enough to set a prickle between his shoulders, as if he were being watched. He inched a goodly distance along streets that actually grew thicker with people and animals and wagons the nearer he came to the docks. The stalls on the bridges over the canals had their shutters down. The street peddlers had picked up their blankets, and the tumblers and jugglers that usually entertained at every street crossing would have had no room to perform if they had not gone away too. There were too many Shonchan. That was how many there were, and maybe 1 in 5 a soldier, plain enough by their hard eyes and the set of their shoulders, so different from farmer or craftsman, even when they were not wearing armor. Now and then a group of Suldam and Damani moved along the street in a little eddy of clear space, more even than soldiers got. It was not given out of fear, at least not by the Shonchan. They bowed respectfully to the women with lightning-marked red panels on the blue dresses, and smiled with approval as the pairs passed by. Veslin was out of his mind. The Shonchan were not going to be driven off by anyone except an army of Ashaman, like the one rumor said had fought them to the east a week ago, or one armed with the Illuminator's secrets. What in the light could a Ludra want with a bell founder? He took pains not to come in sight of the docks. He had learned his lesson on that. What he really wanted was a game of dice, one that would last well into the
Brandon
night,
Sanderson,
preferably
if it
late
wasn't
enough
for
that
him,
Tylen would be asleep when he
the
returned to the
Tylen
palace.
had, the
She
series
had
would
taken
have
away
been
his
completed.
dice, claiming she did not like him gambling,
But I had to check
though
him
she
out
did it
after
after he
this.
talked her into wagering forfeits while he
I'll
was
go
still
ahead and,
confined to bed.
Ring your bell,
Fortunately,
bro.
dice could always be found, and with his luck, it was always better to use the other
Ring
man's
your bell?
dice anyway.
Hell yeah.
Unfortunately, once he
Hey,
discovered she
ring
was
your
not
bell,
about to
I
pay a
go in,
forfeit of letting him go,
Go ahead and
the
ring your
woman
bell.
pretended not to know what he was talking about. He had used them to give her back a bit of her own medicine. A grave mistake, however much fun it had been at the time.
Well, I might have to
Since the forfeits ran out,
check that series
she had
out
been
after
twice as
this.
bad as before. The taverns and common rooms he entered were as packed as the streets, though, with barely room to lift a mug, much less toss dice, full of Sean-Chan laughing and singing,
Yeah, but it wasn't for
glum-faced
Brandon, the
Abudari,
series
who
would
eyed
have
the
been,
Sean-Chan in sullen silence.
completed. I was disappointed
He still
whenever,
queried the innkeepers and tapsters on the chance they
whenever I
might have
found
a
out,
cubbyhole he could rent,
Robert Jordan passed
but
away.
one and all, they shook their
I was,
heads. He
a
had
little
not really expected
disappointed
anything else.
that
There had been nothing available even
series
before all the
wasn't
new arrivals.
going to be
Still, he
finished.
began to feel as gloomy as the foreign merchants he saw peering into their wine and wondering how they were going to get their goods out of the city with no horses. He had gold to pay whatever Luca wanted, and more. But it was all in the chest in the Tarasin Palace, and he was not about to try taking enough out in one go, not after palace servants had carried him back from the docks like a stag taken in hunt. All he had been doing then was talking to ship captains. If Tylen learned, and she would, that he was trying to leave the palace with more gold than he needed for an evening of gambling. Oh no. He had to have a room, a garret in some inn's attic the size of a wardrobe. Anything, where he could hide away gold a little at a time, or he had to have a chance with the dice, one or the other. Luck or no luck, though, he eventually realized that he was going to find neither today. And those bloody dice were still tumbling in his head. Tumbling. He did not stay in any one place long, and not just for the lack of a game or a room. His colorful clothes, his Shema Tinker for Brightness clothes, drew eyes. Some of the Sean-Chan thought he was there for entertainment
Hell
and tried
yeah.
to pay him to
Right
sing.
above. Hey, no
He
problem.
almost let them once or twice.
It's what I
Once
do.
they heard him, they would have demanded the money
I
back.
smoke.
Some of the
listen to a book,
Abudari
try to
men,
get a-
with long curved
a little
knives
tired.
tucked behind their belts and a belly
Yeah,
full of
I
anger
went to
they
go
could
lay
not take
down
out on the
and put a
Sean-Chan,
different audio
thought to
book
take
on.
it out on the buffoon who lacked only a painted face to look like a
I'll play
noble's
the whole
fool.
book.
Matt ducked back
But,
into the crowded
like,
street
tonight,
whenever
I'll
he
do
saw such
Heaven,
fellows
I'll do
eyeing
an
him.
hour or two.
He had learned the hard
Then I'll
way
stop
that he
the
was in no
book.
condition for a fight
And when I
yet,
start up
and
again
his
tomorrow,
killer's
we'll
head
finish
going
where
up
we left
beside the
off,
city
where
gate would do him no good at
you'll be able to
all.
watch
Matt took rest
whole
where he
book.
could find it, on an
Or
empty
listen to
barrel
the whole
abandoned
book, should I
beside
say.
the mouth of an alleyway, on a rare bit of bench in front of a tavern that had room for one more, on a stone step until the building's owner came out and knocked his hat off with a swipe of her broom. His belly was kissing his backbone. He was beginning to feel that everyone was gaping at his garish clothes. The dank cold was seeping into his bones, and the only dice he was going to find were those still thundering away in his head like horses' hooves. He did not think they had ever been this loud before. Nothing for it but to go back into the queen's bloody pet, he growled, using his staff to lever himself up off a cracked wooden crate lying at the side of the street. Several passers-by looked at him as if his face were already painted. He ignored them. Beneath his notice, they were. He was not beating them over the head with his staff as they deserved, goggling at a man that way. The streets really were as full as earlier, he realized, and it would be well after nightfall before he got back to the palace if he tried to make his way through the crowds. Of course, Tylen might be asleep by then. Maybe. His stomach growled, almost loudly enough to drown out the dice. She might order the kitchens not to feed him if he was too late. 10 hard-won paces through the press, and he turned down an alley, narrow and dark. There were no paving stones. The white plaster on the windowless walls was cracked and falling to expose the brick beneath, often as not. The air was rank with the fetid stench of decay, and he hoped that what squished under his boots was mud, even when it gave off a loathsome odor. There were no people, either. He could step out with a good stride. Or what passed for one today. He could hardly wait for the day he could walk a few miles again without panting and aching and needing to lean on a stick. Twisting alleys, most so narrow his shoulders brushed both sides, crisscrossed the city in a maze that was easy to get lost in if you did not know your way. He never took a wrong turn, even when a narrow, crooked passage suddenly forked into 3 or even 4 that all seemed to meander in roughly the same direction. There had been a good many times in Abu Dar when he needed to avoid eyes, and he knew these alleys like he knew his own hand, though oddly enough he still had the feeling he was being watched. He expected to feel that as long as he had to wear those clothes. If he had to struggle through a mass of people and animals from one alley to another, and occasionally shove his way across a bridge that seemed a solid wall of humanity, he was still almost back to the palace in the time it would have taken him to go 3 streets otherwise. Hurrying into the shadowed passage between a well-lit tavern and a shuttered lacquerware shop, he wondered what the kitchens would have ready. More capacious than most, wide enough for 3 if they were friendly, this alley led out onto the Mulhara Square, almost in front of the Tarasin Palace. Suroth was living there, and the cooks had been outdoing themselves since she had had the lot of them flogged after her first meal. There might be oysters with cream, and perhaps gilded fish, and squid with peppers. 10 strides into the shadows, his foot came down on something that did not squish, and he went down in the freezing mud with a grunt, twisting at the last instant, so he did not land on his bad leg. Icy liquid immediately soaked through his coat. He hoped it was water. He grunted again when boots landed on his shoulder. The fellow toppled off of him, cursing and skidding deeper into the alley on the mud, and went to one knee, just managing to catch himself against the side of the tavern short of falling flat himself. Matt's eyes were accustomed to the dim light, enough for him to make out a slender, nondescript man. A man with what appeared to be a large scar on his cheek. Not a man, though. A creature he had seen rip out his friend's throat with one bare hand and take a knife out of its own chest and throw it back at him. And the thing would have landed right in front of him, in easy reach, if he had not tripped. Maybe a little twist of Taviran shaping had worked in his favor, thank the light. All that flashed through his head in the time it took the golem to catch itself against the wall and turn its head to glare at him. With an oath, Matt snatched his falling walking staff and awkwardly hurled it at the creature like a spear. At its legs, hoping to tangle them, gain a moment. The thing flowed aside like water, avoiding the staff, boots sliding a little in the mud, then threw itself toward Matt. The delay had been enough, though. As soon as the staff left his hand, Matt fumbled inside his shirt for the fox-head medallion, breaking the leather cord as he snatched the medallion out. The golem threw itself at him, and he swung the medallion desperately. Silver that had lain cool on his chest brushed across an outstretched hand with a hiss like bacon frying and a smell of burning flesh. Fluid as quicksilver, snarling, the thing tried to dodge by the whirling medallion to seize some part of Matt. Once it laid hands on him, he was as good as dead. It would not try to toy with him this time, as it had in the Rahad. Flailing continuously, he caught it with the fox head on the other hand, across the face, each time with a hiss and stench of burning, as if he had struck with a hot iron. Teeth bared, the golem backed away, but in a crouch on the balls of its feet, hands clawed, ready to jump at the slightest weakness. Not letting the spinning medallion slow, Matt pushed unsteadily to his feet, watching the thing that looked like a man. He wants you dead as much as he wants her, it had told him in the Rahad, smiling. It was not talking or smiling now. He did not know who the her was, or the he, but the rest was clear as good glass. And here he was, barely able to stay on his feet. His leg and hip ached like fire, and his ribs. Not to mention the shoulder the golem had landed on. He had to get back to the street, back among people. Maybe enough people would deter the thing. A small hope, but the only hope he could see. The street was not far. He could hear the babble of voices, hardly softened by distance at all. He took a careful step backward. His boot slid in something that gave off a foul smell and threw him against the tavern's wall. Only frantic swings of the silver fox head kept the golem back. Those voices in the street were so tantalizingly close. They might as well have been in Barcine. Marcin was long dead, and he would be too, soon. "He's down this alley," a man shouted. "Follow me! Hurry! He'll get away!" Matt kept his eyes on the golem. Its gaze flickered beyond him toward the street, and it hesitated. "I am ordered to avoid notice, save by those I harvest," it spat at him. "So you will live a little longer. A little longer." Spinning, it ran down the alley, slipping a little in the mud, yet still seeming to flow as it dodged around behind the tavern. Matt ran after it. He could not have said why, except that it had tried to kill him, would try again, and his hackles were stiff. So it was going to kill him at leisure, was it? If the medallion could hurt it, maybe the medallion could kill it. Reaching the corner of the tavern, he saw the golem at the same time that he glanced back and saw him. Again, the thing hesitated for an instant.
How you doing?
The tavern's back door stood ajar, letting out the sounds of revelry. The creature stuck its hands into a hole left by a missing brick in the back wall of the building opposite the tavern, and Matt stiffened. It hardly seemed to need weapons, but if it had hidden one in there, he did not think he would survive facing that thing with any sort of weapon. Arms followed hands, and then the golem's head went into the hole. Matt's jaw dropped. The golem's chest slithered through, its legs, and it was gone. Through an opening maybe the size of Matt's two hands. "I don't think I've ever seen the like," someone said quietly beside him. And Matt gave a start at realizing he was no longer alone. The speaker was a stoop-shouldered, white-haired old man with a large hooked nose planted in the middle of a sad face and a bundle slung on his back. He was sliding a very long dagger into a sheath beneath his coat. "I have," Matt said hollowly, "Shada Logath." Sometimes bits of his own memory he thought lost floated up out of nowhere, and that one had just surfaced, watching the golem. It was one memory he wished had remained lost. "Not many survive a visit there," the old man said, peering at him. His weathered face looked familiar somehow, but Matt could not place him. "Whatever took you to Shada Logath?" "Where are your friends?" Matt said. "The people you were shouting to." The alleyway held only the two of them. The sounds from the street continued unabated and undisturbed by any cries about anyone getting away if they did not hurry. The old man shrugged. "I'm not certain anyone out there understood what I was shouting. It's hard enough understanding them. Anyway, I thought it might scare off the fellow. Seeing that, though," gesturing toward the hole in the wall, he laughed mirthlessly, showing gaps in his teeth. "I think maybe you and I both have the Dark One's own luck." Matt grimaced. He had heard that too often about himself, and he did not like it. Mainly because he was not sure it was not true. "Maybe we do," he muttered. "Forgive me. I should introduce myself to the man who saved my neck. I'm Matt Cawthon. Are you newcome to Abu Dhar?" That bundle strapped to the fellow's back gave him the look of a man on the move. "We'll have a hard time finding a place to sleep." He took care with the gnarled hand the other man put in his. It was all knobs, as if every bone had been broken at the same time, and it healed badly. It had a strong grip, though. "I'm Noel Charin, Matt Cawthon. No, I have been here some time, but my pallet in the attic of the Golden Ducks is now occupied by a fat Ilianer oil merchant who was rousted from his room this morning in favor of a Shan officer. I thought I'd find somewhere back in this alley for tonight." Rubbing the side of his big nose with a crooked, knobby finger, he chuckled as if sleeping in an alley were of no moment. "It will not be the first time I've slept rough, even in the city." "I think I can do better for you than that," Matt told him. But the rest of what he had been going to say died on his tongue. The dice were still spinning in his head, he realized. He had managed to forget them with the golem trying to kill him, but they were still bouncing, still waiting to land. If they were warning of something worse than the Golem, he did not want to know. Only he would. There was no doubt of that. He would, when it was too late. Chapter 17. Pink Ribbons. Cold winds gusted through the Mulhara, lifting Matt's cloak and threatening to freeze the mud caking his clothing as he and Noel hurried out of the alley. The sun sat on the rooftops, half hidden, and the shadows stretched long. With one hand for his staff, and the other gripping the broken cord of the fox head stuffed into a coat pocket where he could snatch it out if need be, he had to let his cloak go where it would. He ached from head to foot. The dice rattled warning inside his skull, and he hardly noticed either thing. He was too busy trying to watch every direction at once, and wondering just how small a hole that thing could get through. He found himself uneasily eyeing cracks between the square's paving stones, though it hardly seemed likely the thing would come at him in the open. A hum carried from surrounding streets, but here only a slat-ribbed dog moved, running past the fountained statue of long-dead Queen Nerian. Some said her uplifted hand pointed to the ocean's bounty that had enriched Ebudar, and some that it pointed in warning of dangers. Others said her successor had wanted to draw attention to the fact that only one of the statue's breasts was uncovered, proclaiming that Nerian had only been of middling honesty. In other days, the Mulhara would have been full of strolling lovers and lingering street vendors and hopeful beggars at this hour, even in winter. But beggars found themselves snatched off the streets and put to work since the Seanchan came, and the rest stayed away even in daylight. The reason was the Tarasin Palace, that great mound of white domes and marble spires and wrought iron balconies, the residence of Tylan Quintara Mitsobar, or the Grace of the Light, Queen of Altara, or as much of Altara as lay within a few days' ride of Ebudar, Mistress of the Four Winds and Guardian of the Sea of Storms. And, perhaps more important, the residence of the High Lady Suroth, Sabel Meldarath, commanding the forerunners for the Empress of the Seanchan, might she live forever. A position of much greater eminence in Ebudar at the moment. Tylan's green-booted guards stood at every entrance in their baggy white trousers and gilded breastplates worn over green coats, and so did men and women in those insectile helmets with armor striped in blue and yellow or green and white, or any other combination you might happen to think of. The Queen of Altara required security and silence for her rest. Or rather, Suroth said Suroth said Tylan wanted. Tylan soon decided that she did indeed want. After a moment's consideration, Matt led Noel to one of the stable-yard gates. There was more chance of getting a stranger in there than if he used the grand marble stairs that led down into the square. Not to mention a much better chance of getting all the mud off him before he had to face Tylan. She had made her displeasure markedly known the last time he came back disheveled after a tavern brawl. A handful of Ebudari guards stood to one side of the open gates with halberds, and the same number of Seanchan on the other with tasseled spears, all as stiff as Nerian's statue. The light's blessing on all here, Matt murmured politely to the Ebudari guards. It was always best to be polite to Ebudari until you were sure of them. Afterwards, too, for that matter. Even so, they were more flexible than the Seanchan. And on to you, my lord, the stocky officer replied, ambling forward, and Matt recognized him. Sullivan Sarat, a good fellow, always ready with a quip and possessing a fine eye for horses. Shaking his head, Sullivan tapped the side of his pointed helmet with the thin gilded rod of his office. Have you been in another fight, my lord? She will go up like a waterspout when she sees you. Squaring his shoulders and trying not to lean so obviously on his staff, Matt bristled. Ready with a quip. Come to think on it, the Sundark man had a tongue like a rasp, and his eye for horses was not all that fine either. Will there be any questions if my friend here beds down with my men? Matt asked gruffly. There shouldn't be. There's room for one more with my fellows. Room for more than one, truth be told. 8 men had died so far, following him to Ebudar. None for me, my lord, Sullivan said, though he eyed the scrawny man at Matt's side and pursed his lips judiciously. Noel's coat appeared of good quality, though, at least in the dim light, and he did have his lace, and in a better state than Matt's. Perhaps that tipped the balance. And she doesn't need to know everything, so none from her either. Matt scowled, but before intemperate words could put himself and Noel in the soup kettle, 3 armored Shanshan galloped up to the gate, and Sullivan turned to face them.
You and your lady wife live in the Queen's palace?
Noel inquired, starting toward the gate. Matt pulled him back. Wait on them, he said, nodding toward the Shanshan. His lady wife? Bloody women? Bloody dice in his bloody head. I have dispatches for the High Lady Suroth, one of the Shanshan announced, slapping a leather satchel hanging from one armored shoulder. Her helmet bore a single thin plume, marking her a low-ranking officer, yet her horse was a tall dun gelding with a look of speed. The other 2 animals were sturdy enough, but there was nothing to be said for them beyond that. Enter with the blessings of the light, Sullivan said, bowing slightly. The Shanshan woman's bow from her saddle was a mirror of his. The blessings of the light be on you also, she drawled, and the 3 of them clattered into the stable yard. It is very strange, Sullivan mused, peering after the 3. They always ask permission of us, not them. He flicked his rod toward the Shanshan guards on the other side of the gates. They had not stirred an inch from their rigid stance or even glanced at the arrivals that Matt had noticed.
And what would they do if you said they couldn't go in?
Noel asked quietly, easing the bundle on his back. Sullivan spun on his heel. It is enough that I have given oath to my queen, he said in an expressionless voice. And she has given hers, where she has given it. Give your friend a bed, my lord, and warn him there are things better left unsaid in Abu Dar. Questions better left unasked. Noel looked befuddled and began protesting that he was simply curious, but Matt exchanged further benisons and courtesies with the Altaran officer, as quickly as he could, to be sure, and hustled his newfound acquaintance through the gates, explaining about listeners in a low voice. The man might have saved his hide from the Golam, but that did not mean he would let the fellow hand it over to the Shanshan. They had people called Seekers, too, and from the little he had heard, even people who spoke freely about the Death Watch Guard locked their teeth when it came to the Seekers. From the little he had heard, Seekers made White Cloak questioners look like boys tormenting flies. Nasty, but hardly anything to worry a man.
I see,
the old man said slowly.
I hadn't known that.
He sounded irritated with himself.
You must spend a good deal of time with the Shanshan. Do you know the High Lady Suroth as well, then? I must say I had no idea you had such high connections.
I spend time with soldiers in taverns when I can, Matt replied sourly. When time let him. Light, he might as well be married. Suroth doesn't know I'm alive, and he devoutly hoped it remained that way. The 3 Shanshan were already out of sight, their horses being led into the stables, but several dozen Sultan were giving Damani their evening exercise, walking them in a big circle around the stone-paved yard. Nearly half the gray-clad Damani were dark-skinned women, lacking the jewelry they had worn as windfinders. There were more like them in the palace and elsewhere. The Shanshan had had a rich harvest from seafolk vessels that had failed to escape. Most wore sullen resignation or stony faces, but 7 or 8 stared ahead of them, lost and confused, disbelieving still. Each of those had a Shanshan-born Damani at her side, holding her hand or with an arm around her, smiling and whispering to her under the approving eyes of the women who wore the bracelets attached to their silvery collars. A few of those dazed women clutched the Damani walking with them as if holding to lifelines. It would have been enough to make Matt shiver if his damp clothes had not already been doing the job. He tried to hurry Noel across the yard, but the circle brought a Damani who was neither Shanshan nor Afa'an Mier near him, linked to a plump grain Sultan. An olive-skinned woman who might have passed for Altaran and someone's mother. A stern mother, with possibly a fractious child from the way she regarded her charge. Teslin Baradin had fleshed out after a month and a half in Shonchan captivity, yet her ageless face still looked as if she ate briars 3 meals a day. On the other hand, she walked placidly on her leash and obeyed the Suldam's murmured directions without hesitation, pausing to bow very deeply to him and Noel. For an instant, though, her dark eyes flashed hatred at him before she and the Suldam continued their circuit of the stable yard. Placidly, obediently. He had seen Damani upended and switched till they howled in this same stable yard for making any sort of fuss, Teslin among them. She had done him no good turns, and maybe a few bad, but he would not have wished this on her. Better than being dead, I suppose, he muttered, moving on. Teslin was a hard woman, likely plotting every moment how to escape, yet hardness only took you so far. The mistress of the ships and her master of the blades had died on the stake without ever screaming, but it had not saved them.
You believe that?
Noel asked absently, fumbling awkwardly with his bundle again. His broken hands had handled that knife well enough. They seemed clumsy at everything else. Matt frowned at him. No, he was not sure he believed it. Those silver eyedums seemed too much like the invisible collar Tylan had on him. Then again, Tylan could tickle him under the chin the rest of his life if it kept him off the stake. He wished those bloody dice in his head would just stop and get it over with. No, that was a lie. Since he had finally realized what they meant, he had never wanted the dice to stop. The room Chell Vannin and the surviving Red Arms shared lay not far from the stables, a long white-plastered chamber with a low ceiling and too many beds for those who remained alive. Vannin, a balding, suety heap, was lying on one in his shirt sleeves, an open book propped on his chest. Matt was surprised the man could read. Spitting through a gap in his teeth, Vannin eyed Matt's mud-smeared clothes. "You been fighting again?" he asked. "She won't like that, I reckon." He did not rise. With a few startling exceptions, Vannin considered himself as good as any lord or lady. "Trouble, Lord Matt," Hanin growled, leaping to his feet. He was a solid man, physically and by temperament, but his heavy jaw clenched, twisting the hawk crudely tattooed on his cheek. "Begging your pardon, but you're in no condition for it. Tell us what he looks like and we'll sort him out for you." The last 3 gathered behind him with eager expressions, 2 grabbing for their coats while still tucking in shirt tails. Metwin, a boyish-appearing Kyrienan, who was 10 years older than Matt, instead picked up his sword from where it was propped at the foot of his bed and eased a little of the blade out of the scabbard to check the edge. He was the best of them with a sword, very good indeed, though Gorderon came close for all he looked a blacksmith. Gorderon was not nearly as slow as his thick shoulders made him appear. A dozen Red Arms had followed Matt Coffin to Abrudar. 8 of those were dead, and the rest were stuck here in the palace where they could not pinch the maids, get into a fight over dice, and drink till they fell on their faces, as they could staying at an inn and knowing the innkeeper would see them carried up to their beds, though maybe with their purses a little lighter than they had been. "Noel can tell you what happened better than I can," Matt replied, pushing his hat back on his head. "He'll be bedding in here with you. He saved my life tonight." That brought exclamations of shock and cries of approbation for Noel, not to mention slaps on the back that almost toppled the old fellow. Vannin went so far as to mark his place in the book with a fat finger and sit up on the side of his thin mattress. Setting his bundle down on a vacant bed, Noel told the tale with elaborate gestures, laying down his own roll, and even making himself a bit of a buffoon, slipping in the mud and gaping at the Gollum, while Matt fought like a champion. The man was a natural storyteller, as good as a gleeman for making you see what he described. Harnan and the Red Arms laughed genially, knowing what he was about, not stealing their captain's thunder, and approving of it. But laughter died when he came to Matt's attacker slipping away through a tiny hole in a wall. He made you see that, too. Vannin put down his book and spat through his teeth again. The Golem had left Vannin and Harnan half dead in the Rahad. Half dead because it was after other prey. The thing wants me for some reason, it seems, Matt said lightly when the old man finished and sank onto the bed with his belongings, seemingly exhausted. It probably played a dice with me sometime, I don't recall. None of you has to worry, as long as you don't get between it and me. He grinned, trying to make it all a joke, but no one so much as smiled. In any case, I'll parcel out gold to you in the morning. You'll book passage on the first ship leaving for Ilion, and take Ulver with you. Tom and Julian, too, if they'll go. He imagined the thief-catcher would, anyway. And Naram, and Lopin, of course. He had gotten used to having a pair of serving men look after him, but he hardly needed them here. Talmanis must be somewhere close to Camelin by this time. You shouldn't have much trouble finding him. When they were gone, he would be alone with Tylan. Like he would rather face the Golem again. Arnon and the other 3 Red Arms exchanged looks, Fergus scratching his head as if he did not quite understand. He might not. The Holy Man was a good soldier, not the best mind, but good enough. Yet he was not very bright when it came to other things. That wouldn't be right, Arnon allowed finally. One thing, Lord Talmanas would have our hides if we came back without you. The other 3 nodded. Fergus could understand that. And you, Vannon? Matt asked. The fat man shrugged. I'd take that boy away from Roselle, and he'll gut me like a trout the first time I go to sleep. I would myself in his boots. Anyway, I got time to read here. Don't get much chance for that working as a farrier. That was one of the itinerant trades he claimed to follow. The other was stableman. In truth, he was a horse thief and poacher. The best in 2 countries, and maybe more. You're all mad, Matt said with a frown. Just because it wants me doesn't mean it won't kill you if you get in the way. The offer stays open. Anyone who comes to his senses can go. I have seen your like before, Noel said suddenly. The stooped old man was the image of hard age and exhaustion, but his eyes were bright and sharp, studying Matt. Some men have an air about them that makes other men follow where they lead. Some lead to devastation, others to glory. I think your name may go into the history books. Arnon looked as confused as Fergus. Vannon spat and lay back down, opening his book. If all my luck goes away, maybe, Matt muttered. He knew what it took to get into the histories. A man could get killed doing that sort of thing. Better clean up before she sees you, Fergus piped up suddenly. All that mud will put a burr under her saddle for sure. Snatching his hat off angrily, Matt stalked out without a word. Well, he stalked as well as he could, hobbling on a walking staff. Before the door closed behind him, he heard Noel starting a story about one time he sailed on a seafolk ship and learned to bathe in cold salt water. At least, that was how it began. He intended to get himself clean before Tylan saw him. He did. But as he limped through hallways hung with the flowered tapestries Abudari called summer hangings, for the season they evoked, 4 serving men in the palace's green and white livery and no fewer than 7 maids suggested he might want to bathe and change his clothes before the queen saw him, offering to draw him a bath and fetch clean garments without her learning of it. They did not know everything about him and Tylan. Thank the light. No one but Tylan and himself knew the worst bits, but they knew too bloody much. Worse, they approved. Every last flaming servant in the whole flaming Taurussan palace. For one thing, Tylan was queen, and could do as she pleased, so far as they were concerned. For another, her temper had been on a razor's edge since the Seanchan captured the city, and if Matt Cawthon scrubbed in Brighton lace kept her from snapping their noses off for trifles, they would scrub behind his ears and wrap him in lace like a Sunday gift. Mud, he said to a pretty smiling maid, spreading her skirts in a curtsy. There was a twinkle in her dark eyes, and the plunging neckline of her bodice displayed a fair amount of bosom to almost rival Rozelle's. On another day, he might have taken a little time to enjoy looking. What mud? I don't see any mud. Her mouth dropped open, and she forgot to straighten, staring at him with her knees bent as he hobbled away. Jewel and Sandar, rounding a corner quickly, nearly walked into him. The tyrant thief-catcher leaped back with a muffled oath, his swarthy face turning gray until he realized who had almost run him over. Then he muttered an apology and started to hurry on by. "Has Tom got you mixed into his foolishness, Julian?" Matt asked. Julian and Tom shared a room deep in the servants' quarters, and there was no excuse for him to be up here. In that dark tyrant coat flaring over his boot tops, Julian would stand out among the servants like a duck in a chicken coop. Suroth was strict about things like that, stricter than Tylin. The only reason for it Matt could see was whatever Tom and Beslin were meddling with. "No, don't bother telling me. I've made an offer to Harnan and the others, and it's open to you too. If you want to leave, I'll give you the money for it." Actually, Julian did not look ready to tell him anything. The thief-catcher tucked his thumbs behind his belt and met Matt's gaze levelly. "What did Harnan and the others say? And what is Tom doing that you call foolish? This is one set of rooftops he knows his way around better than you or I." "The Golan is still in Abu Dar, Julian." Tom knew that the game of houses was what he knew, and he loved sticking his nose into politics. "The thing tried to kill me earlier this evening." Julian grunted as if he had been hit in the pit of his belly and scrubbed a hand through his short black hair. "I have a reason to stay a while longer," he said. "Even so." His air changed slightly, something stubborn and defensive and tinged with guilt. He had never shown a roving eye that Matt had seen, but when a man looked like that, it could only mean one thing. "Take her with you," Matt said. "And if she won't go, well, you'll not be in Tyr an hour before you have a woman on each knee. That's the thing about women, Julian. If one says no, there's always another will say yes." A serving man hurrying by with an armload of linen towels stared at Matt's muddiness in amazement, but Julian thought it was at him. He snatched his thumbs free of his belt and attempted to adopt a more humble stance, without much success. Tom might sleep with the servants, yet from the beginning he had somehow made it seem to be his own choice, an eccentricity, and no one thought it odd to see him up here, perhaps slipping into Rozelle's rooms that had once been Matt's. Julian had gone on at length about being a thief-catcher, never a thief-taker, and stared so many prickly lordlings and complacent merchants in the eye to show he was as good as they, that everyone in the palace knew who and what he was, and where he was supposed to be, which was below stairs. "My lord is wise," he said too loudly, making a stiff, jerky bow. "My lord knows all about women. If my lord will forgive a humble man, I must return to my place." Turning to go, he spoke over his shoulder, still in a carrying voice. "I heard today that if my lord comes back one more time looking like he's been dragged in the street, the queen intends taking a switch to my lord's person." And that was the stone that broke the wagon clean in two. Flinging open the doors of Tylin's apartments, Matt strode in, sailed his hat across the width of the room, and stopped dead, his mouth hanging open and everything he had planned to say frozen on his tongue. His hat hit the carpets and rolled, he did not see where. A gust of wind rattled the tall, triple-arched windows that led out onto a long, screened balcony overlooking the Mulhara. Tylin turned in a chair carved to look like gilded bamboo and stared at him over her golden wine cup. Waves of glossy black hair, touched with gray at the temples, framed a beautiful face with the eyes of a bird of prey, and not one best pleased at the moment. Inconsequential things seemed to leap at him. She kicked her crossed legs slightly, rippling layered green and white petticoats. Pale green lace trimmed the oval opening in her gown that half exposed her full breasts, where the jeweled hilt of her marriage knife dangled. She was not alone. Suroth sat facing her, frowning into her wine cup and tapping long fingernails on the arm of her chair. A pretty enough woman, despite her hair being shaved to that long crest, except that she made Tylin seem a rabbit by comparison. 2 of those fingernails on each hand were lacquered blue. Seated at her side was a little girl, of all things, also in an elaborately flowered robe over pleated white skirts, but with a sheer veil covering her entire head. It seemed to be shaved completely, and wearing a fortune in rubies. Even in a state of shock, he noticed rubies and gold. A slender woman, nearly as dark as her stark black gown, and tall, even had she been Aiel, stood behind the girl's chair with her arms folded and ill-concealed impatience. Her wavy black hair was short, but not shaved at all, so she was neither of the blood nor Sojin. Imperiously beautiful, she put Tylan and Suroth both in the shade. He noticed beautiful women, too, even when he did feel hit in the head with a hammer. It was not the presence of Suroth or the strangers that jerked him to a halt, though. The dice had stopped, landing with a thunder that made his skull ring. That had never happened before. He stood there waiting for one of the Forsaken to leap out of the flames in the marble fireplace, or the earth to swallow the palace beneath him. "You aren't listening to me, pigeon," Tylan cooed in dangerous tones. "I said, take yourself down to the kitchens and have a pastry until I have time for you. Have a bath while you're about it." Her dark eyes glittered. "We will discuss your mud later." In a daze, he ran it through again in his head. He had walked into the room, the dice had stopped, and nothing had happened. Nothing. "This man has been set upon," the tiny veiled figure said, rising. Her tone turned cold as the wind outside. "You told me the streets were safe, Suroth. I am displeased." Something had to happen. It already should have. Something always happened when the dice stopped. "I assure you, Tuan, the streets of Ebudar are as safe as the streets of Shandar itself," Suroth replied, and that pulled Matt out of his stupor. She sounded anxious. Suroth made other people anxious. A slender, graceful young man in the almost transparent robe of a Dako veil appeared at her side with a tall blue porcelain pitcher, bowing his head and silently offering to replenish her wine. And giving Matt another start. He had not realized anyone else was present in the room. The yellow-haired man in his indecent garment was not the only one either. A slim but nicely rounded, red-haired woman wearing the same sheer robe was kneeling beside a table that held spice bottles and more fine seafolk porcelain wine pitchers, and a small gilded brass brazier with the pokers needed for heating the wine, while a graying, nervous-eyed serving woman wearing green and white House Mitsubar livery stood at the other end. And in one corner, so motionless that he still almost missed her, yet another Sean Chan, a short woman with half her golden head shaved and a bosom that might outmatch Rozelle's if her dress of red and yellow panels had not covered her neck to the chin. Not that he had any real desire to find out. Sean Chan were very touchy about their Sojin. Tylan was touchy about any woman. There had not been a serving woman younger than his grandmother in her apartments since he was able to get out of bed. Suroth looked at the graceful man as though wondering what he was, then shook her head wordlessly and turned her attention back to the child, Tuan, who waved the fellow away. The liveried serving maid scurried forward to take the pitcher from him and tried to refill Tylan's cup, but the queen made a very small gesture that sent her back to the wall. Tylan was sitting very, very still. Little wonder that she wanted to avoid notice if this Tuan frightened Suroth, as she plainly did. "I am displeased, Suroth," the girl said again, sternly frowning down at the other woman. Even standing, she did not have all that far down to stare at the seated High Lady. Matt supposed she must be a High Lady too, only higher than Suroth. "You have recovered much, and that will please the Empress. May she live forever. But your ill-considered attack eastward was a disaster that must not be repeated. And if the streets of this city are safe, how can he have been set upon?" Suroth's knuckles were white from gripping the chair arm and her wine cup. She glared at Tylan as though the lecture were her fault, and Tylen gave her an apologetic smile and bowed her head. Oh, blood and ashes, he was going to pay for that. I fell down, that's all. His voice might as well have been fireworks for the way heads whipped around. Suroth and Tuon looked shocked that he had spoken. Tylen looked like an eagle who wanted her rabbit fried. My ladies, he added, but that did not seem to improve anything. The tall woman suddenly reached out and snatched the wine cup from Tuon's hand, throwing it into the fireplace. Sparks showered up the chimney. The serving woman stirred as if to retrieve the cup before it could be damaged further, then subsided at a touch from the Sojin. You are being foolish, Tuon, the tall woman said, and her voice made the girl's sternness seem laughter. The too familiar Seanchan drawl seemed almost absent entirely. Suroth has the situation here well in her control. What happened to the East can happen in any battle. You must stop wasting time on ridiculous trifles. Suroth gaped at her in astonishment for an instant before she could assume a frozen mask. Matt did a little gaping on his own part. Use that tone of voice to one of the blood, and you were lucky to escape with a trip to the flogging post. Shockingly, Tuon inclined her head slightly. You may be right, Anath, she said calmly, and even with a touch of deference. Time and the omens will tell. But the young man plainly is lying. Perhaps he fears Tylen's anger. But his injuries clearly are more than he could sustain falling down, unless there are cliffs in the city I have not seen. So he feared Tylen's anger, did he? Well, come to that, he did, a little. Only a little, mind. But he did not like being reminded of it. Leaning on his shoulder-high staff, he tried to make himself comfortable. They could ask a man to sit, after all. I was hurt the day your lads took the city, he said with his cheekiest grin. Your lot were flinging around lightning and balls of fire, something fierce. I'm just about healed, though. Thank you for asking. Tylen buried her face in her wine cup and still managed to shoot him a look over the rim that promised retribution later. Tuon's skirts rustled as she crossed the carpets to him. The dark face behind that sheer veil might have been pretty without the expression of a judge passing sentence of death. And with a decent head of hair instead of a bald pate. Her eyes were large and liquid, but utterly impersonal. All of her long fingernails were lacquered, he noticed, a bright red. He wondered whether that signified anything. Why, a man could live in luxury for years on the price of those rubies. She reached up with one hand, putting her fingertips under his chin, and he started to jerk back, until Tylen glared at him over Tuon's head, promising retribution here and now if he did any such thing. Glowering, he let the girl shift his head for her study. You fought us, she demanded. You have sworn the oaths? I swore, he muttered. For the other, I had no chance. So you would have, she murmured. Circling him slowly, she continued her study, fingering the lace at his wrist, touching the black silk scarf tied around his neck, lifting the edge of his cloak to examine the embroidery. He endured it, refusing to shift his stance, glowering fit to match Tylen. Like he had bought horses without so thorough an examination. Next, she would want to look at his teeth. The boy told you how he was injured, Anath said in frosty tones of command. If you want him, then buy him and be done. The day has been long, and you should be in your bed. Tuon paused, examining the long signet ring on his finger. It had been carved as a tri-piece to show the carver's skills. A running fox and two ravens in flight, all surrounded by crescent moons, and he had bought it by chance, though he had come to like it. He wondered whether she wanted it. Straightening, she stared up at his face. Good advice, Anath, she said. How much for him, Tylen? If he is a favorite, name your price, and I will double it. Tylen choked on her wine and began coughing. Matt almost fell off his staff. The girl wanted to buy him? Well, she might as well have been looking at a horse for all the expression on her face. He is a free man, High Lady, Talon said unsteadily when she could speak. I cannot sell him. Matt could have laughed if Talon did not sound as though she were trying to keep her teeth from chattering, if Bloody Tuon had not just asked his price. A free man. Ha! The girl turned away from him as though dismissing him from her mind. You are afraid, Talon, and under the light you should not be. Gliding to Talon's chair, she lifted her veil with both hands, baring the lower half of her face, and bent to kiss Talon lightly, once on each eye and once on the lips. Talon looked astounded. You are a sister to me, and to Surath, Tuan said in a surprisingly gentle voice. I myself will write your name as one of the blood. You will be the High Lady Talon, as well as Queen of Altara, and more, as was promised you. Anath snorted loudly. Yes, Anath. I know. The girl sighed, straightening and lowering her veil. The day has been long and arduous, and I am weary. But I will show Talon what lands are in mind for her, so she will know and be easy in her mind. There are maps in my chambers, Talon. You will honor me by accompanying me there? I have excellent masseuses. The honor is mine, Talon said, sounding not all that much steadier than before. At a gesture from the Sojin, the yellow-haired man went running to open the door and kneel holding it open. But there was still all the smoothing and adjusting of clothes that women had to do before they would go anywhere, Sean-Chan or Altaran, or from anywhere else. Though the red-haired Dakavale performed the function for Tuan and Surath. Matt took the opportunity to draw Talon a little aside, far enough that he would not be overheard. The Sojin's blue eyes kept coming back to him, he realized, but at least Tuan, accepting the attentions of the slender Dakavale woman, seemed to have forgotten he existed. I didn't just fall down, he told Talon softly. The Golem tried to kill me not much more than an hour ago. It might be best if I left. The thing wants me, and it'll kill anybody near me, too. The plan had just occurred to him, but he thought it had a good chance of success. Talon sniffed. It cannot have you, Piglet. She directed a look at Tuan that might have made the girl forget about Talon being a sister had she seen. And neither can she. At least she had sense enough to whisper. Who is she? He asked. Well, it had never been more than a chance. The High Lady Tuan, and you know as much as I, Talon replied just as quietly. Surath jumps when she speaks. And she jumps when Anath speaks, though I would almost swear that Anath is some sort of servant. They are a very peculiar people, sweetling. Suddenly she flaked some mud from his cheek with one finger. He had not realized he had mud on his face, too. Suddenly the eagle was strong in her eyes. Do you recall the pink ribbons, sweetling? When I come back, we'll see how you look in pink. She swanned out of the room with Tuan and Surath, trailed by Anath and the Sojin and the Dakavale, leaving Matt with the grandmotherly serving woman who began to clean up the wine table. He sank into one of the bamboo-carved chairs and rested his head in his hands. Any other time, those pink ribbons would have had him gibbering. He never should have tried to get his own back with her. Even the Golem did not occupy much of his thoughts. The dice had stopped, and... what? He had come face to face, or near enough, with 3 people he had not met before, but that could not be it. Maybe it was something to do with Talon becoming one of the blood. But always before, when the dice stopped, something had happened to him personally. He sat there worrying over it while the serving woman called in others to carry everything away. Sat there until Tylen returned. She had not forgotten about the pink ribbons, and that made him forget about anything else for quite a long time. Chapter 18. An Offer. The days after the golem tried to kill him settled into rhythms that irritated Matt no end. The gray sky never altered except to give rain or not. There was talk in the streets of a man being killed by a wolf not far outside the city, his throat ripped. No one was worried, just curious. Wolves had not been seen close to Abu Dar in years. Matt worried. City people might believe a wolf would come that close to city walls, but he knew better. The golem had not gone away. Harnan and the other Red Arms stubbornly refused to leave, claiming they could watch his back. And Bannon refused without reasons, unless a muttered comment that Matt had a good eye for fast horses was supposed to be one. He spat after he said it, though. Rizal, her olive face pretty enough to make a man swallow, her big dark eyes knowing enough to dry his tongue, inquired about Olver's age. When he said close on 10, she looked surprised and tapped her full lips thoughtfully, but if she changed anything in the boy's lessons, he still came away from them bubbling equally over her bosom and the books she read him. Matt thought Olver would almost have given up his nightly games of snakes and foxes for Rizal and the books. And when the lad ran out of the rooms that once had been Matt's, Tom often slipped in with his harp under his arm. By itself, that was enough to make Matt grind his teeth, only that was not the half. Tom and Veslin frequently went out together, not inviting him, and were gone for half the day or half the night. Neither would say a word more about their schemes, though Tom had the grace to look embarrassed. Matt hoped they were not going to get people killed for nothing, but they showed little interest in his opinions. Veslin glared at the very sight of him. Julian continued to slip above stairs and was seen by Surov, which earned him a strapping hung up by his wrists from a stall post in the stables. Matt saw his welts tended by Vannon. The man claimed doctoring men was the same as doctoring horses, and warned him it could be worse next time, but the fool was back on the upper floors that very night, still wincing from the weight of his shirt on his back. It had to be a woman, though the thief-catcher refused to say. Matt suspected one of the Shonchan noblewomen. One of the palace servants could have met him in his own room with Tom out of it so much. Not Surath or Tuon, to be sure, but they were not the only Shonchan high blood in the palace. Most of the Shonchan nobles rented rooms, or more often whole houses in the city, but several had come with Surath, and a handful with the girl, too. More than one of the women looked a pleasant armful in spite of their crested heads and their way of staring down their noses at everybody without shaved temples, if they noticed them more than they did the furniture, that was. If it seemed unlikely that one of those haughty women would look twice at a man who slept in the servants' quarters, well, the like-new women had peculiar tastes in men. He had no choice but to leave Julian alone. Whoever the woman was, she might get the thief-catcher beheaded yet, but that sort of fever had to burn itself out before a man could think straight. Women did strange things to a man's head. The newly arrived ships disgorged people and animals and cargo for days on end, enough that the city's massive walls would have burst from the inside had they all stayed. But they flowed through the city and out into the countryside with their families and their crafts and their livestock, prepared to put down roots. Soldiers passed through in thousands, too. Well-ordered infantry and cavalry with the flair of veterans, moving north in bright-colored armor, and east across the river. Matt gave up trying to count them. Sometimes he saw strange creatures, though most of those were unloaded above the city to avoid the streets. Torm, like three-eyed, bronze-scaled cats the size of horses, sending most real horses around them into a frenzy just by their presence, and Korm, like hairy wingless birds as tall as a man, tall ears twitching constantly, and long beaks seeming to yearn for flesh to rend, and huge Threadit, with their long noses and longer tusks. Rakan and the larger Rakan flew from their landing site below the Rahad, huge lizards spreading wings like bats and carrying men on their backs. The names were easy enough to pick up. any Shan soldier was eager to discuss the necessity of scouts on Rocken and the abilities of Korlm at tracking, whether Sredit were useful for more than moving heavy loads, and Torm too intelligent to trust. He learned a great deal of interest from men who wanted what most soldiers did, a drink and a woman and a bit of a gamble, not necessarily in any given order. Those soldiers were indeed veterans. Shan was an empire larger than all the nations between the Arth Ocean and the spine of the world, all under one empress, but with a history of almost constant rebellions and revolts that kept its soldiers' skills keen. The farmers would be harder to dig out. Not all the soldiers left, of course. A strong garrison remained, not only Shan but steel-veiled Terrabonner lances and Amadisian pikemen with their breastplates painted to resemble Shan armor. And Altarans, too, besides Thailand's house armsmen. According to the Shan, the Altarans from inland, with red slashes crisscrossing their breastplates, were Thailands as much as the fellows guarding the Tarasin Palace, which, strangely, did not seem to best please her. It did not please the fellows from inland very much either. They and the men in Mitsubar's green and white eyed each other like strange tomcats in a small room. There was plenty of glaring going on. Terrabonners at Amadisians, Amadisians at Altarans, and the other way around. Well-aged, long-standing animosities bubbling to the surface, but no one went further than shaken fists and a few curses. 500 men of the Death Watch guards had come off the ships and remained in Abu Dar for some reason. The ordinary sort of crime expected in any large city had fallen off dramatically under the Shan. But the guards took to patrolling the streets as if they expected cut-purses, bully boys, and maybe fully armed bands of brigands to spring out of the pavement. The Altarans and the Amadisians and the Terrabonners kept their tempers reined in. No one but a fool argued with the Death Watch guards, not more than once. And another contingent of the guards had taken up residence in the city, too. 100 Ogier, of all things, in the red and black. Sometimes they patrolled with the others, and sometimes they wandered about with their long-handled axes on their shoulders. They were not at all like Matt's friend Loyal. Oh, they had the same wide noses and tufted ears and long eyebrows that drooped to their cheeks beside their eyes the size of teacups. But the gardeners looked at a man as though wondering whether he needed pruning of a few limbs. Nobody at all was fool enough to argue even once with the gardeners. Shan flowed out from Abu Dar, and news flowed in. Even when they had to sleep in the attic, merchants preened in the common rooms of inns, smoking their pipes and telling what they knew that no one else did, so long as the telling did not affect their profits. The merchants did little for profits they would not share, and told everything, some of it true. Seamen spread tales for anyone who would buy a mug of ale, or better, hot-spiced wine, and when they had drunk enough, they talked even more, of ports they had visited, and events they had witnessed, and likely dreams they had had after the last time their heads were full of fumes. Still, it was clear the world outside Abu Dar was seething like the sea of storms. Tales of Aiel looting and burning came from everywhere, and armies were on the move other than the Shan. Armies in Tyr and Murundi, in Arad Daman and Andor, in Amadisia, which was not yet entirely under Shan control, and dozens of armed gatherings too small to be called armies in the heartland of Altara itself. Except for the men in Altara and Amadisia, no one really seemed sure who intended to fight whom, and there was some doubt about Altara. Altarans had a way of taking advantage of troubles to try paying off grievances against their neighbors. The news that shook the city most, though, was of Rand. Matt tried his best not to think of him, or Perrin, but avoiding those odd swirls of color in his head was difficult when the Dragon Reborn was on everyone's lips. The Dragon Reborn was dead, some claimed, murdered by Aes Sedai, by the whole White Tower descending on him at once in Kyrian. Or maybe it was in Ilion, or Tyr. No, they had kidnapped him. He was held prisoner in the White Tower. No, he had gone to the White Tower on his own and sworn fealty to the Amerlin seat. The last gained great credence because a number of men claimed to have seen a proclamation, signed by Elida herself, that announced as much. Matt had his doubts about Rand being dead or swearing fealty, at least. For some odd reason, he felt sure he would know if Rand died. And as for the other, He did not believe the man would put himself within 100 miles of the White Tower voluntarily. Dragon Reborn or no Dragon Reborn, he had to have more sense than that. That news, all the versions of it, stirred the Shan Chan the way a stick stirs an ant-heap. High-ranking officers strode the halls of the Tarasin Palace at every hour of the day and night, their odd plumed helmets beneath their arms, their boots ringing on the floor tiles, their faces set. Couriers raced away from Ebu Dar on horses and on Torakan. Suldam and Damani began patrolling the streets instead of just standing guard at the gates, once more hunting for women who could channel. Matt kept out of the officer's way and nodded politely to the Suldam when he passed one in the streets. Whatever Rand's situation was, he could do nothing about it in Ebu Dar. First, he had to get out of the city. The morning after the Golem tried to kill him, Matt burned every last one of the long pink ribbons, the whole great wad of them, in the fireplace as soon as Tylan left her apartments. He also burned a pink coat she had had made for him, 2 pairs of pink breeches, and a pink cloak. A stench of burning wool and silk filled the rooms, and he opened some windows to let it out. But he did not really care. He felt a great relief dressing himself in bright blue breeches and embroidered green coat and a blue cloak with painfully ornate working. Even all the lace did not bother him. At least none of it was pink. He never wanted to see anything that particular color ever again. Clapping his hat on his head, he stumped out of the Tarasin Palace with renewed determination to find that cubbyhole to store what he needed for his escape, if he had to visit every tavern, inn, and soldier's dive in the city 10 times over. Even those in the Rahad, 100 times. Gray gulls and black-winged skimmers swirled in leaden sky that promised more rain, and an icy wind carrying the tang of salt whipped across the Mulhara, flailing cloaks about. He thumped the paving stones as though intending to crack every one. Light, if need be, he would go with Luca in what he wore. Maybe Luca would let him work his way as a buffoon. The man would probably insist on it. At least that would keep him close to Aludra and her secrets. He stalked the whole width of the square before he realized that he was in front of a wide white building he knew well. The sign over the arched door proclaimed the Wandering Woman. A tall fellow in red and black armor strode out, 3 thin black plumes on the front of the helmet under his arm, and stood waiting for his horse to be brought around. A bluff-faced man with gray at his temples, he did not look at Matt, and Matt avoided looking at him. No matter how pleasant the man might appear on the surface, he was a Death Watch guard after all, and a banner general to boot. The Wandering Woman, so near the palace, had every room rented by high Shan officers, and for that reason he had not been back since he was able to walk again. Ordinary Shan soldiers were not such bad fellows, ready to gamble half the night and buy a round when it came their turn, but high-ranking officers might as well be nobles. Still, he had to start somewhere. The common room was almost as he remembered, high-ceilinged and well-lighted by lamps burning on all the walls, despite the early hour. Solid shutters covered the tall, arched windows now for warmth, and fires crackled in both long fireplaces. A faint haze of pipe smoke filled the air, and the smell of good cooking from the kitchens. 2 women with flutes and a fellow with a drum between his knees were playing a quick, shrill Ebu Dari tune that he nodded in time to. Not so different from when he had stayed there, so far as it went. But all of the chairs held Shan now, some in armor, others in long, embroidered coats, drinking, talking, studying maps spread out on the tables. A graying woman with the flame of a Der Suldam embroidered on her shoulder seemed to be making a report at one table, and at another, a skinny Suldam with a round-faced Damani at her heels appeared to be getting orders. A number of the Shan had the sides and backs of their heads shaved, so they seemed to be wearing bowls, with the hair remaining at the back, left long in a sort of wide tail that hung to the shoulders on men and often to the waist on women. Those were simple lords and ladies, not high anything, but that hardly mattered. A lord was a lord, and besides, the men and women going to fetch a serving maid for more drinks had the smooth-cheeked, disdainful look of officers themselves, which meant the folk they were fetching for had rank to cause a man trouble. Several noticed him and frowned, and he almost laughed. Then he saw the innkeeper coming down the railless stairs at the back of the room, a stately hazel-eyed woman with large golden hoops in her ears and a little gray in her hair. Setela Anan was not Ibudari, or even Altaran, he suspected, but she wore the marriage knife hanging hilt down from a silver collar into a deep, narrow neckline, and a long, curved blade at her waist. She knew he was supposed to be a lord, but he was not sure how far she believed any longer, or what good it would do if she still swallowed the whole faradiddle. In any case, she saw him at the same instant and smiled, a friendly, welcoming smile that made her face even prettier. There was nothing for it but to go and greet her and ask after her health, not too elaborately. Her muscular husband was a fishing boat captain with more dueling scars than Matt wanted to think about. Straight off, she wanted to know about Nynaeve and Elaine, and to his surprise, whether he knew anything about the kin. He had no idea she had even heard of them. They went with Nynaeve and Elaine, he whispered, cautiously keeping watch to make sure no Seanchan was paying them any mind. He did not intend to say too much. Talking about the kin where Seanchan might hear made the back of his neck prickle. So far as I know, they're all safe. Good. I would be pained had any of them been collared. The fool woman did not even lower her voice. Yes, that's good, he muttered, and hurriedly explained his needs before she could start shouting how happy she was that women who could channel had escaped the Seanchan. He was happy too, just not happy enough to put himself in chains for joy. Shaking her head, she seated herself on the steps and put her hands on her knees. Her dark green skirts, sewn up on the left side, showed red petticoats. Ebudari really did seem to knock tinkers on their heels when it came to choosing colors. The buzz of Seanchan voices fought with the high-pitched music all around them, and she sat there looking at him sternly. You don't know our ways. That is the trouble, she said. Pretties are an old and honored custom in Altara. Many a young man or woman has a final fling as a pretty, pampered and showered with presents, before settling down. But you see, a pretty leaves when she chooses. Tylan shouldn't be treating you as I hear she is. Still, she added judiciously, I must say she dresses you well. She made a circling motion with one hand. Hold out your cloak and turn around so I can get a better look. Matt drew a deep, calming breath. And then 3 more. The color flooding his face was sheer fury. He was not blushing. Certainly not. Like, did the whole city know? Do you have a space I can use or don't you? He demanded in a strangled voice. It turned out that she did. He could use a shelf in her cellar, which she said stayed dry year-round. And there was the small hollow under the kitchen's stone floor where he once had kept his chest of gold. It turned out the rental price was for him to hold out his cloak and turn around so she could get a better look. She grinned like a cat. One of the Seanchan, a buzzard-faced woman in red and blue armor, enjoyed the show so much that she tossed him a fat silver coin with strange markings, a forbidding woman's face on one side and some sort of heavy chair on the other. Still, he had his place to store clothes and money, and once he returned to the palace, to Tylan's apartments, he found out he had clothes to store in it. I fear my lord's garments are in a terrible state, Naram said lugubriously. The skinny, gray-haired Karyanan would have been as dolorous announcing the gift of a sack of fire drops, though. His long face was perpetually in mourning. He did keep an eye on the door against Tylan's return, however. Everything is quite filthy, and I am afraid mildew has ruined several of my lord's best coats. They were all in a cupboard with Prince Beslin's childhood toys, my lord. Lopin laughed, tugging at the lapels of a dark coat like Julian's. The balding man was the reverse of Narim, stout instead of bony, dark instead of pale, his round belly always shaking with laughter. For a time, after Nelisian's death, it had seemed he intended to compete with Narim at sighing, the way they did over everything else, but the intervening weeks had recovered him to his normal self. As long as no one mentioned his former master, anyway.
They are dusty, though, my lord. I doubt anyone has been in that cupboard since the prince put his toy soldiers away.
Feeling that his luck was running strong at last, Matt told them to start taking his clothes across to the Wandering Woman, a few pieces at a time, and a pocket full of gold each trip. His black-hafted spear, propped in a corner of Tylen's bedchamber, with his unstrung Two Rivers bow, would have to wait for last. Getting that out might be as difficult as getting himself out. He could always make a new bow for himself, but he was not going to abandon the Ashandarai. I paid too high a price for the bloody thing to leave it, he thought, fingering the scar hidden beneath the scarf around his neck. One of the first among too many. Light, it would be nice to think that he had more to look forward to than scars and battles he did not want. And a wife he did not want or even know. There had to be more than that. First came getting out of Abu Dar with a whole hide, though. That above all else, first. Lopen and Narim bowed themselves out of his presence with the equivalent of 2 fat purses spread about their clothing so as not to create any bulges. But no sooner had they gone than Tylen appeared, wanting to know why his body servants were running in the halls as though racing each other. If he had been feeling suicidal, he could have told her they were racing to see who would be first to reach the inn with his gold, or maybe just the first to start cleaning his clothes. Instead, he busied himself diverting her, and soon enough that chased any other thoughts out of his head, except for a glimmer that his luck had finally begun to pay off at something besides gambling. All it needed to put the cap on would be for Ludra to give him what he wanted before he left. Talon put her mind to what she was doing, and for a time, he forgot fireworks and Ludra and escaping. For a time. After a little searching through the city, he finally located a bell founder. There were a number of gong makers in Abu Dar, but only one bell maker, the foundry outside the western wall. The bell maker, a cadaverous, impatient fellow, sweated in the heat of his huge iron furnace. The sweltering foundry's one long room might have been some sort of torture chamber. Hoisting chains dangled from the rafters, and sudden flames gouted from the furnace, throwing flickering shadows and leaving Matt half blind. And no sooner would he blink away the afterimage of a raging fire than another eruption would leave him squinting again. Workmen, dripping with sweat, poured molten bronze from the furnace's melting pot into a square mold, half again as tall as a man, that had been levered into position on rollers. Other great molds like it stood around the stone floor, amid a litter of smaller molds in various sizes.
My lord is pleased to jest.
Master Sutoma forced a chuckle, but he did not look amused, with his damp black hair hanging down and clinging to his face. His chuckle sounded as hollow as his cheeks, and he kept shooting frowns at his workmen as though suspecting they would lie down and go to sleep if he did not maintain a close watch on them. A dead man could not have slept in that heat. Matt's shirt stuck to him damply, and he was beginning to sweat his coat through in patches.
I know nothing of illuminators, my lord, and I wish to know nothing. Useless fripperies, fireworks, not like bells. If my lord will excuse me, I am very busy. The High Lady Suroth has commissioned 13 bells for a victory set, the largest bells ever cast anywhere. And Calwyn Sutoma will cast them.
That it was a victory over his own city did not seem to bother Sutoma in the least. The last was enough to make him grin and rub his bony hands together. Matt attempted to make Eludra relent, but the woman might as well have been cast bronze herself. Well, she was considerably softer than bronze once she finally let him put an arm around her. Yet kisses that left her trembling did nothing to slacken her resolve. Me? I do not believe in telling a man more than he needs to know, she said breathlessly, sitting beside him on a padded bench in her wagon. She allowed no more than kisses, but she was very enthusiastic about those. The thin, beaded braids she had taken to wearing again were a tangle. Men gossip, yes? Chatter, chatter, chatter. And you yourselves don't know what you will say next. Besides, maybe I have made you the puzzle just to make your return, yes? And she set about further disarraying her hair, and his as well. She put up no more night flowers, though, not after he told her about the chapter house in Tanchico. He tried 2 more visits to Master Sutoma, but on the second, the bellmaker had the doors barred against him. He was casting the largest bells ever made, and no foolish foreigner with foolish questions would be allowed to interfere with that. Tylen began lacquering the first 2 fingernails on each hand green, though she did not shave the sides of her head. She would eventually, she told him, pulling her flowing black hair back with her hands to steady herself in the gilt-framed mirror on the bedchamber wall, but she wanted to become used to the idea first. She was making her accommodations with the Shan Chan, and he could not fault her for it, no matter how many dark scowls Beslin gave his mother. There was no way she could suspect anything about Aludra, but the day after he first kissed the Illuminator, the grandmotherly maids disappeared from her chambers, replaced by women white-haired and wizened. Tylen began sticking her curved belt knife into one of the bedposts at night, close to hand, and musing aloud in his hearing about how he would look in Adako Vale's sheer robes. In fact, night was not the only time she stuck her knife in the bedpost. Grinning serving women started delivering summonses to Tylen's rooms by simply telling him that she had stabbed the bedpost, and he started trying to avoid any woman in livery he saw with a smile on her face. It was not that he disliked being bedded by Tylen, aside from the fact she was a queen, as snooty as any other noblewoman, and the fact that she made him feel like a mouse that had been made a pet by a cat. But there were only so many hours of daylight, if more than he was used to back home in winter, and for a bit he had to wonder whether she meant to consume all of them. Luckily, Tylen began spending more and more time with Surath and Tuon. Her accommodations seemed to have embraced friendship, with Tuon at least. No one could be friends with Surath. Tylen seemed to have adopted the girl, or the girl had adopted her. Tylen told him little of what they talked about, except in the sketchiest outlines, and often not even that. But they closeted themselves alone for hours, swept along the palace corridors conversing quietly, or sometimes laughing. Frequently, Anath, or Salusha, Tuon's golden-haired Sojin, trailed along behind, and now and then a pair of hard-eyed Death Watch guards. He still could not figure out the relationship between Surath, Tuon, and Anath. On the surface, Surath and Tuon behaved as equals, calling each other by name, laughing at one another's jests. Tuon certainly never gave Surath any order, at least not in his hearing. But Surath seemed to take Tuon's suggestions as orders. Anath, on the other hand, badgered the girl unmercifully, razor-sharp criticisms, calling her a fool and worse. "This is the worst sort of stupidity, girl," he heard her say coldly one midday in the halls. Tylen had not sent her crude summons yet, and he was trying to sneak out before she could, slipping along the walls and peeking around corners. He had a visit to Sutoma planned, and another to Aludra. The 3 Shonchan women, 4 counting Salusha, but he did not think they saw it that way, were clustered just around the next turning. Trying to keep an eye out for serving women wearing a smile, he waited impatiently for them to move. Whatever they were talking about, they would not appreciate him blundering by in the middle of it. "A taste of the strap will set you right and clear your head of nonsense," the tall woman went on in a voice like ice. "Ask for it, and be done." Matt worked a finger in his ear and shook his head. He must have misheard. Salusha, standing placidly with her hands folded at her waist, certainly never turned a hair. Surath gasped, though. "Surely you will punish her for this?" she drawled angrily, glaring holes through Anath. Or trying to. Surath might as well have been a chair for all the notice the tall woman gave her. "You do not understand, Surath." Tuon's sigh stirred the veil covering her face. Covering, but not concealing. She looked resigned. He had been shocked to learn she was only a few years younger than he. He would have said more like 10. Well, 6 or 7. "The omens say otherwise, Anath," the girl said calmly, and not at all in anger. She was simply stating facts. "Be assured, I will tell you if they change." Someone tapped him on the shoulder, and he looked back into the face of a serving woman wearing a broad grin. Well, he had not really been that anxious to go out right away. Tuan troubled him. Oh, when they passed in the hallways, he made his best leg politely, and in return she ignored him as completely as Surath or Anath did. But it began to seem to him that they passed in the hallways a little too often. One afternoon, he walked into Tylen's apartments, having checked and found out that Tylen was shut up with Surath on some business or other, and in the bedchamber he found Tuan examining his Ashandarai. He froze at the sight of her fingering the words in the old tongue, carved into the black shaft. A raven in some still darker metal was inlaid at each end of the line of script, and a pair of them engraved in the slightly curved blade. Ravens were an imperial sigil to the Shan Chan. Not breathing, he tried to move backwards without making a sound. That veiled face swiveled toward him. A pretty face, really. It might even have been beautiful if she ever stopped looking as though she was about to bite off a mouthful of wood. He no longer thought she looked like a boy. Those tight, wide belts she always wore made sure you noticed what curves there were. But she was the next thing to it. He seldom saw a grown woman younger than his grandmother that he did not at least think idly of what it would be like dancing with her, maybe kissing her, even those snooty Shan Chan blood. But never a glimmer of that crossed his mind with Tuan. A woman had to have something to put an arm around, or what was the point? I don't see Tuan owning a thing like this, she drawled coolly, setting the long-bladed spear back next to his bow. So it must be yours. What is it? How did you come to possess it? Those cold demands for information set his jaw. The bloody woman could have been ordering a servant. Right as far as he was aware, she did not even know his name. Tylen said she had never asked about him or mentioned him since the offer of purchase. It's called a spear, milady, he said, resisting the urge to lean against the doorframe and tuck his thumbs behind his belt. She was Shan Chan blood, after all. I bought it. I will give you 10 times the price you paid, she said. Name it. He almost laughed. He wanted to, and not for pleasure. That was certain sure. No, would you think of selling? Just, I will buy it, and here is what I will pay. The price wasn't gold, milady. Involuntarily, his hand went to the black scarf to make sure it still hid the ridged scar that encircled his neck. Only a fool would pay it 1 time, let alone 10. She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable no matter how sheer her veil. And then he might as well have vanished. She glided past him as though he were no longer there and swept out of the apartments. That was not the only time he encountered her alone. Of course, she was not always followed by Anath, or Selucia, or guards, yet it seemed to him that rather too often he would decide to go back for something and turn to find her by herself, looking at him. Or he might leave a room suddenly and find her outside the door. More than once he looked over his shoulder leaving the palace and saw her veiled face peering out of a window. True, there was nothing of staring about it. She looked at him and glided away as though he had ceased to exist, peered from a window and turned back into the room as soon as he saw her. He was a stand lamp in the corridor, a paving stone in the Malhara. It began to make him nervous, though. After all, the woman had offered to buy him. A thing like that had a tendency to make a man nervous by its own self. Even Tuan could not truly upset his well sense that things were finally coming right, though. The Golem did not return, and he began to think maybe it had gone on an easier harvest. In any event, he was staying away from dark and lonely places where it might have a chance at him. His medallion was all very well for what it did, but a good crowd was better. On his latest visit to Aludra, she had almost let something slip, he was certain of it, before coming to herself and hastily bundling him out of her wagon. There was nothing a woman would not tell you if you kissed her enough. He stayed away from the wandering woman to avoid rousing Tylen's suspicions, but Naram and Lopen stealthily transferred his real clothing to the inn's cellar. Bit by bit, half the contents of the iron-bound chest under Tylen's bed traveled across the Mulhara to the hidden hollow beneath the inn's kitchen. That hollow under the kitchen floor began to trouble him, though. It had been good enough for hiding the chest. A man could break chisels getting into that. He had been living upstairs at the inn then, too. Now the gold would just be spilled into the hole after Satala cleared the kitchen. What if someone began to wonder why she chased everybody out when Lopen and Narum came? Anybody at all could lift up that floor stone if they knew where to look. He had to make sure himself. Afterwards, long afterwards, he would wonder why the bloody dice had not warned him. Chapter 19. 3 Women. The wind was out of the north, with the sun not yet fully above the horizon, which the locals said always meant rain. A sky full of clouds certainly threatened as he made his way across the Mulhara. The particular men and women in the common room of the Wandering Woman had changed. There were no Suldam or Damani this time, but the place was still full of shonchan and pipe smoke, though the musicians had not yet appeared. Most of the people in the room were breakfasting, sometimes eyeing the bowls uncertainly as if unsure what they were being asked to eat. He felt that way himself about the strange white porridge Abu Dari liked for breakfast. But not everyone was intent on food. 3 men and a woman in those long embroidered robes were playing cards and smoking pipes at one table, all with their heads shaved in the fashion of lesser nobles. The gold coins on their table caught Matt's attention for a moment. They were playing for high stakes. The largest stacks of coins sat in front of a tiny black-haired man, as dark as a Noth, who grinned wolfishly at his opponents around the very long stem of a silver-mounted pipe. Matt had his own gold, though, and his luck at cards had never been as good as at dice. Mistress Annan, however, had gone out on some errand or other while it was still dark, so her daughter Mara said, leaving Mara herself in charge. A pleasingly plump young woman, with big pretty eyes the same hazel shade as her mother's. She wore her skirts sewn up to mid-thigh on the left side, something Mistress Annan would not have allowed when he was staying there. Mara was not best pleased to see him, frowning as soon as he approached her. 2 men had died by his hand in the inn when he was staying there. Thieves who were trying to split his skull, to be sure, but that sort of thing did not happen at the Wandering Woman. She made it clear she was happy to see the back of him when he moved out. Mara was hardly interested in what he wanted now either, and he could not really explain. Only Mistress Annan knew what was hidden in the kitchen, so he devoutly hoped. And he certainly was not about to bleed out the information in the common room. So he made up a tale about missing the dishes the cook turned out, and eyeing that blatantly sewn skirt, he slipped in the implication that he had missed looking at her even more. He could not understand why exposing a little more petticoat was scandalous when every woman in Abu Dar walked around showing half her bosom. But if Mara was feeling rakish, maybe a few blandishments might ease his path. He gave her his very best smile. Giving him half an ear in return, Mara seized a passing serving maid, a smoky-eyed cat of a woman he knew well. Captain Yulin's cup is almost empty, Kyra, Mara said angrily. You are supposed to keep it full. If you can't do your job, girl, there are plenty in Abu Dar who will. Kyra, several years older than Mara, made her a mocking curtsy and scowled at Matt. Before Kyra could straighten her knees again, Mara turned to grab a boy who was walking by carefully balancing a tray piled with dirty dishes. Stop lollygagging, Ross, she snapped. There is work to be done. Do it, or I'll take you out to the stables, and you will not like that, I tell you. Mara's youngest brother glared at her. I can't wait till spring when I can work on the boats again, he muttered sullenly. You've been in a bad skin ever since Friel got married, just because she's younger than you, and you haven't been asked yet. She directed a cuff at his head that he easily eluded, though the stacked cups and plates rattled and nearly fell. Why not just pin up your petticoats at the fishing docks? He shouted, darting off before she could slap at him again. Matt sighed as she finally turned her full attention to him. Pinning up petticoats was a new one on him, but from Mara's face, he could guess. Steam should have been jetting from her ears. If you want to eat, You must come back later. Or you can wait, if you like. I don't know how long before you can be served." Her smile was malicious. No one would choose to wait in that common room. Every seat was taken by a Shan-Chan. And there were more Shan-Chan standing, enough that the aproned maids were forced to weave their way carefully, holding trays of food and drink aloft. Kyra was filling the dark little man's cup and offering him the sort of sultry smiles she had once offered Matt. He did not know why she had soured on him, but he had as many women in his life as he could handle at the moment. What was an air captain, anyway? He would have to find out later. "I will, wait in the kitchen," he told Mara. "I want to tell Enid how much I enjoyed her cooking." She started to protest, but a Shan-Chan woman raised her voice demanding wine. Grim-eyed in blue and green armor, with a helmet carrying 2 plumes under her arm, she wanted her stirrup cup right then. All of the maids seemed occupied, so Mara grimaced at him one last time and went scurrying, trying to set her face in a pleasant smile. And not getting far with it. Holding his walking staff wide, Matt flourished a bow to her retreating back. The good smells that had mingled with sweet pipe smoke in the common room permeated the kitchen, roasting fish, baking bread, meats sizzling on the spits. The room was hot from the iron stoves and the ovens and the fire in the long brick fireplace, and 6 sweating women and 3 potboys were dashing about under the orders of the chief cook. Wearing a snowy white apron as if it were a tabard of office, and wielding a long-handled wooden spoon to reign over her domain, Enid was the roundest woman Matt had ever seen. He did not think he could have gotten his arms around her had he wanted to. She recognized him right away, and a sly grin split her wide olive face. "So you found out I was right," she said, pointing the spoon at him. "You squeezed the wrong melon, and it turned out the melon was a lionfish in disguise, and you were just a plump grunter." Throwing back her head, she cackled with laughter. Matt forced a grin. Blood and bloody ashes. Everybody really did know. "I have to get out of this bloody city," he thought grimly, "or I'll hear the rest of my life." Suddenly, his fears about the gold began to seem foolish. The gray floorstone in front of the stoves appeared firmly in place, no different from any other in the kitchen. You had to know the trick in order to lift it. Lopen and Nerim would have told him if so much as a single coin had vanished between their visits. Mistress Annan likely would have tracked down and skinned the culprit if anyone tried thieving in her inn. He might as well be on his way. Maybe Eludra's willpower would be weaker at this hour. Maybe she would give him breakfast. He had slipped out of the palace without waiting to eat. So as not to rouse curiosity about his visit, he did tell Enid how much he had enjoyed her gilded fish, how it was better than that served in the Tarasin Palace, without having to exaggerate even a whisker. Enid was a marvel. The woman positively beamed, and to his surprise, lifted one out of the oven onto a platter just for him. Somebody in the common room could just wait, she told him, setting the platter at the end of the kitchen's long work table. A wave of her spoon brought a stout potboy with a stool. Looking at the golden-crusted flatfish, he felt his mouth watering. Eludra likely would be no weaker now than any other time. And if she was upset over being disturbed so early, she might not give him breakfast. His stomach rumbled loudly. Hanging his cloak on a peg beside the door to the stable yard, and propping his walking staff beneath, he tucked his hat under the stool and turned back his lace to keep it out of the platter. By the time Mistress Annan came in through the door to the stable yard, swinging her cloak off and shaking rain onto the floor, little remained beyond a tangy taste on his tongue and fine white bones on the platter. He had learned to enjoy a number of odd things since coming to Abu Dar, but he left the eyes staring up at him. The things were on the same side of the fish's head. Another woman slipped in behind Mistress Annan as he dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin. She closed the door behind her quickly and kept her damp cloak on, with the hood pulled well up. Rising, he caught a glimpse of the face inside that hood and nearly knocked his stool over. He thought he covered well, though, making a leg to the women, but his head was spinning. "It is well you are here, my lord," Mistress Anand said briskly, handing her cloak to a potboy. I would have sent for you otherwise. Enid, clear the kitchen, please, and watch the door. I need to speak with the young lord alone. The cook briskly herded the undercooks and potboys out into the stable yard. Despite their muttered complaints about the rain and wails about the food burning, it was clear they were as accustomed to this as Enid. She herself did not even glance at Mistress Anand and her companion again before hurrying through the door into the common room, with her long spoon held up like a sword. What a surprise, Jolene Maza said, tossing her hood back. Her dark woolen dress, with a deep neckline in the local style, fit loosely and looked worn and frayed. You would never have thought it from her carefree attitude, though. When Mistress Anand told me she knew a man who might take me with him when he left Abu Dar, I never guessed it was you. Pretty and brown-eyed, she had a smile almost as warm as Kyra's, and an ageless face that screamed Aes Sedai, with dozens of Shonchan just the other side of a door, guarded by a cook with a spoon. Removing her cloak, Jolene turned to hang it on one of the pegs, and Mistress Anand made an irritated sound in her throat. That isn't safe yet, Jolene, she said, sounding more as if talking to one of her daughters than to an Aes Sedai. Until I have you safely. Suddenly a commotion rose at the door to the common room, Enid protesting in a shout that no one could enter, and a voice almost as loud in Shonchan accents, demanding that she move aside. Ignoring the protests of his leg, Matt moved faster than he thought he ever had in his life, grabbing Jolene by the waist and plunking himself down on the bench by the door to the stable yard with the Aes Sedai in his lap. Hugging her close, he pretended to be kissing her. It was a fool way to try hiding her face, but all he could think of short of throwing her cloak over her head. She gasped indignantly, but fear widened her eyes when she finally heard the Shonchan voice, and she snaked her arms around him in a flash. Praying for his luck to hold, he watched the door open. Still protesting loudly, Enid backed into the kitchen, thumping away with her spoon at the Sojin with a wet cloak hanging down his back, who was pushing her ahead of him. A heavy-set, scowling man with a stub of a braid that did not even come close to reaching his shoulder, he fended off most of her blows with his free hand and seemed...
All right, everyone. I'm going to call Entry's live for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone keeps stopping by. I appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.